Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
When people think of craft, certain images may come to mind. Perhaps knitting in a rocking chair by a warm fireplace. People think of it as a quiet, solitary activity that doesn't make much of a public statement. But crafts like knitting can be radical. The rocking chair by the fireplace isn't just quiet and solitary. It can be a site of real political change. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the power of craft. Later in the show, we'll hear from a Connecticut potter who hopes to bring awareness to the indigenous Wangunk people that have too often been forgotten. But up first, we're talking about creators whose work combines craft with activism in a movement that's aptly called craftivism. Betsy Greer is a writer and maker who helped popularize the term craftivism. She's author of Knitting for Good, a guide to creating personal, social, and political change stitch by stitch. Betsy, it's wonderful to have you on Disrupted.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So you have this really distinct title of being called the godmother of craftivism, which I think is excellent. You have edited a book called Craftivism, The Art of Craft and Activism. Define for our listeners what that term craftivism means.
Sure. I think for me, it means using your skills, your creative skills, specifically maybe your craft skills, for towards the greater good. And I've left it pretty open. My background is in DIY and punk, and I like the idea of putting an idea out into the world and telling people, hey, here are some loose guidelines. What can you bring to it?
You know, one of the things that I find so intriguing about this concept, not just the concept, but really the community behind this concept, is that it affirms creativity as really an act of resistance, a way for people to express themselves that doesn't have to conform to a particular set of guidelines that I think people often feel pressure to fit into a particular box or to be pushed into that. But it allows people to create, to collaborate, and to be able to put ideas and creations into the atmosphere. You talked a little bit about your own background, but tell us more about how you got involved in crafting and activism.
I came to it by accident. I didn't grow up as an activist, but I started knitting in New York around 2000 and started talking to people about craft, what it meant to them, and learned that my grandmother knit hats for babies at a local hospital in Georgia, and thought about how people create change in their world and the different ways that they do it. Some people may give money, some people may give their time, some people may make things. And I started having these conversations just about my grandmother, basically, who never would say that she was an activist, just someone that made stuff. And then people started sharing examples of various projects people have done around various wars, various illnesses, like to raise awareness of maybe a disease, or like the AIDS quilt, for example, the NAMES Project. And I thought, wow, there are so many examples. And I Googled craftivism, and there were 4 hits on Google, and it was for the Church of Craft doing some workshops in New York. And I thought, this is a really good opportunity to start talking about how craft and activism are related. And I didn't coin the term. The internet is kind of wrong on that fact. I actually popularized it. But to see how a word kind of spreads through just me talking about it with friends, and if it spreads, that was very early in the internet, and then I kept hearing more and more examples, and I wanted to share them, so I did.
You know, you said that you were not someone who had been involved in activism per se before. But I also hear from you, Betsy, that how we even think of the term or the moniker of an activist should be more fluid.
that there are people who are active on political issues or policy questions, and there are others whose activism is affirming community and affirming experience and reducing the kind of isolation that some people may feel as they're navigating challenges. And I'm thinking here back to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, when one way that many people expressed their activism was by creating masks, as there was this
Right.
public debate about whether people should mask, what that means for their views. There were people who were crafting these beautiful masks for first responders and frontline workers and everyday people to say, we, in the face of all of this pain and ugliness, can have a beautiful mask that protects us, but also connects us, even when it's a challenge. How do you find that kind of tension within the craftivist community of what does it mean to be an activist, who should define that, and whether we should even get into that territory?
Well, I think that people have a lot of definitions and they have their own definitions for things, and I don't want to ever give really a definitive thing about this is one thing, or this is activism, or this is craftivism, or this isn't. I don't think personally that's my place. I think that there are many ways to be an activist, and I think that using your creativity is just one of them. Like you mentioned, the COVID-19 mask was a way for people to connect, to use their skills. I mean, the amount of fabric that was bought at that period was really high, of people wanting to help, and people want to help, and they want to use their voice, and they don't always know how. And sometimes it's scary. Sometimes there are certain things you don't know how to say. Sometimes there are things you can't say based on what may be happening politically. And I think that creating through an activist lens can mean just making something for yourself that shares a feeling that you have that may be scary to say out loud or to protest with a sign, but you can say it to yourself first. And I find that really beautiful, because there is so much shame and silencing and erasure. And so stitching something or making something that says, this is who I am, this is what I believe, can be an act of empowerment, whether you share it with other people or not.
I think it is that sense of agency, of being able to decide for yourself, is this something that I want to share with others and publicly? Is this something that holds meaning for me privately? And not feeling like we have to create this hierarchy, but to be able to say people should have the right to decide how they express themselves and when. And also the connection of that. I live in a community that has lots of artists of all different stripes. And I'm remembering a few years ago during the pandemic, there was this yarn bombing activity. And I know that, you have spoken about what that means as well. It was this beautiful way for people across the community to come together to create what I saw as public art, but the public connection that in many ways defied a lot of the gender stereotypes around crafting and craftivism, and just brought people together where they were in terms of their skill and ability, their interests. People who never felt seen and visible in the community now had this lasting reminder that if we are able to be still for a moment and take in that creativity and beauty, what comes out of that? What do you see in those sort of collective acts of craftivism that help build community, in some ways in an act of defiance, but also just an act of coming together?
Yeah, I think one important thing to note here too is that it isn't just like under the term craftivism. That's just like an umbrella term, right? It could be creative resistance, it could be artivism, it could be yarn bombing, it could be many, many, many things. The cool part about craft to me personally is that many people know how to craft, right? It crosses generations, it crosses so many different cultural divides and allows us to come together. And like you said, and I know I have been out wearing something that I knit, and then somebody has come up to me that doesn't, speak English. Unfortunately, I don't speak any other languages. yet. And then we've been able to have kind of a conversation about craft because of that, just with a few words, right, that we each knew. And I love that connection. And to me, craft is so important because there's this utilitarian base to it. And so it's not maybe necessarily gate kept in the same way that maybe art is. People have different feelings about it. And I love that openness and the way that we can come together.
I also think, Betsy, in some ways, crafting, the craft community, craftivists are stereotypes in a lot of ways. You know, I mentioned gender before. I think there's also an age dynamic to that. There sometimes are assumptions about people's class status or who is quote unquote welcomed into a community. How do you see those misconceptions and the ways that your experiences really resist or push back against some of those misconceptions?
When I first started knitting, I was 25, and people are like, "What are you doing?" And I started knitting because I wanted to do something that in my head, quote, older people did, which was a very wrong misconception, one that you still see in commercials and ads that people pull out of what someone that crafts looks like. And then you see it in certain media as well, right? When we focus on, which I have done in the past, you focus on what is being made versus who is making. And then you start opening that up and realizing everyone creates, everyone makes, and that we forget that because of maybe social media, what rises to the top or whatever, or who's paying attention to what hashtags or what's rising on TikTok, when everybody across all ages and races and cultures and backgrounds and genders creates. I think we need to remember that we're all creative, especially when things get scary and overwhelming like they have been recently and during the pandemic. It's important to connect with ourselves through making and connect through others. But we can lose that very easily when things get scary, which they often are.
That was writer and maker Betsy Greer, author of Knitting for Good, a guide to creating personal, social, and political change, stitch by stitch. Coming up, Betsy describes examples of craft and activism that stand out to her, including ones from Argentina and Belarus. And later, a potter talks about work that's influenced by his indigenous Wangunk ancestry. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the radical power of craft. We've been talking with writer and maker Betsy Greer. She's editor of the book Craftivism, The Art of Craft and Activism. She's also author of Knitting for Good, a guide to creating personal, social, and political change stitch by stitch. During our conversation, I talked with Betsy about the economic components of craft. Back in May of 2025, fabric retail giant Joann closed its doors. And whether we're thinking about small, locally owned stores or larger chains like Joann, I was curious about how the economic dynamics play out.
Yeah, they are definitely there. And I think that we are all being sold to all the time. And you think about fabric, or with big box closures like Joann, and who is going to lose out on that with the different geographic areas and all their coupons. They kept fabric really cheap, but there are many local stores, like you mentioned, and they may have a different price point, which could be an issue, which is an issue for people. But there's also places like estate sales. There are places like, old garments that you have in your closet that you want to redo. There are people that have tons of fabric that, will sometimes give them away on various free cycle sites, or there are places like creative reuse centers, and there are other places because we have so much fabric in this world. We have a ton of fabric. of fabric. And when you start asking around, especially for yarn, people that started knitting and then they knit and they bought like a lot of yarn and then never knit again. Like it's when I worked in a yarn store, people are always bringing in like, a ton of yarn that no one used. But there are financial issues that are also at play here. And I think that if you just look at stores alone and not other places that we can find fabric or yarn, then you may not see that there are a lot of options out there that may be better.
I have a kid who did a science fair project on fast fashion and textile waste, and then looking at ways that people are reclaiming those fabrics for different kinds of uses. And it really made me more aware of the creativity of creators and crafters, but also the ways that people are negotiating their relationship to quote unquote stuff and defining. And for me, that is in and of itself a political act of saying, I can be creative. I can connect with people. I can think about what I have that you don't have, that we could share or we could learn from each other, and building those connections. And I think, Betsy, as you mentioned, it's a scary time for many people. And it would be easier for people to just retreat and not engage. But you see this craftivist community that is engaging on their own terms in a way that is affirming and not just promoting the fear. Are there examples of craftivism that stand out to you right now that you are finding meaning in or finding inspiration in these times that can be very scary for people?
Sure. I think that when we talk about activism, we talk about different movements, I think social media can be great, but one of the things that it does wipe out is this idea that you can start something small. There was a group in the 70s called the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Their loved ones had disappeared and been murdered. And there were 14 women that went out in the plaza with embroidered nappies or diapers on their head of the missing people. That later grew into a much larger movement. There was a rift several years after this began, and one side became a political party. There's now the abuelas that are politically active. So that was just a group of 14 women that went out. And I think that we think we have to have tons and tons of people, but I don't think that we do. We just need, ourselves are a small group. So that's one example. There's also a woman called Rufina Bazlova who had the stitching project about political prisoners in Belarus and is speaking out about them using traditional Belarusian embroidery. And then she was living in Belarus. Now she's living in Prague. There's also the Protest Banner Lending Library, a project by Aramhan Cifuentes, that people make banners together. They stitch them, and you can use them in a protest if you want to. You also can stitch things that, again, may feel scary to say out loud because you are in a position of people trying to erase who you are or to shame who you are. But you can make this in a community together, make these banners. You can also rent them, I believe, still. But there are different projects out there. That's just a couple. There are many more, and I'm always looking for other projects to talk about. If anyone has any projects to share, please do, because some projects we hear about, but some projects have been lost to history, and I think that it's important to share those. And that's my current mission, to share people's stories so that people know that there are many ways to be an activist or a craftivist.
I am curious what craftivism, what being part of these spaces, what has this taught you about yourself, Betsy?
Sure. So I started talking about how important it was, sharing these stories and did it for a really long time and was like, kind of like, why am Why am I so drawn to this, right? And then I realized several years ago that I'd been attacked in my early 20s and remembered and was like, oh, so I have these stories that I'm sharing. And then I realized that I had been silencing my own voice and my own experience. And that at times, because of all the shame, I physically couldn't speak or say my own name. And I was like, I needed something. I needed examples of how people were brave against really scary things and how they stood up, how they shared their voice. And so that was the underlying current that I didn't even know was there. And then now my projects are about voice and sharing that making is important and making can give you your voice. My personal work is about that. That's the undercurrent through it all. All of it is voice and speaking up in a way. Maybe it's just to yourself and being able to look at yourself in the mirror. Maybe it's able to go out in public and share who you are and tell your stories. I think voice and telling your stories are the undercurrent to it all, to me.
What do you say to people who may be afraid to find their voice or
Yeah,
may be afraid to do that? What do you say?
so in mentioning that I was attacked, I made a piece and I wrote on fabric that was like, you too can thrive after assault. And I wrote it down. This was a couple of years ago, and I threw it away because it was too scary. And I was like, oh my gosh, I talk about this all the time. What is going on? And a couple months later, I was visiting a friend in Iceland. Her name is Sigrun. She's amazing, who is a craftivist and doing amazing work um, around her own history. And I was with her in the car. And I was like, I think I can do this with you in the car. And I made it. And then there's a picture of me holding it up against this sea in Iceland against the coast with the roar of the ocean. And that was a really important moment for me because you see how like we can do things together. We can do things alone. Like some things you may be able to do alone, but we can also do things together. And it's going to be different for everybody, given what is scary to you and how scary it is. And I think that, like what I just said, like sometimes it's too scary to do by yourself. And some people that may be a larger community that may be sharing anonymously online and getting feedback. It may be just thinking about a project because life can be terrifying. And we are not alone in that. And I think that it can be really easy to think that we are. And then that can kind of calcify around us, or at least it did me. This is my own personal story. No one else's, but my experience is that through making with ourselves, with other people, it can be a great way to heal along in tandem with other things, right? Like therapy and meds, also important. But I think that that creativity can be a great balm as well as a buoy, as well as a lighthouse to help us get through things.
I feel like that is a title for a new book, Betsy, crafting as balm, buoy. So let us know in Lighthouse, let us know when that book is out. But I do want to just thank you because there's a power in being able to be vulnerable. And there's a power in being able to convey that vulnerability through crafting, but also, as you said, to help people realize they don't have to do everything alone. And that there are many people who are trying to figure out a pathway together, a pathway forward, and a pathway that allows us to do scary things on our own terms. And it doesn't have to look the same way. That is the beauty, that is the power of what you do and what others are doing to build together. And I think sometimes we need that reminder as we are facing uncertainty. Betsy Greer is a writer and maker. She's editor of the book Craftivism, The Art of Craft and Activism, and also author of Knitting for Good, a guide to creating personal, social, and political change, stitch by stitch. Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, a potter talks about bringing craft to the next generation.
Our job as a teacher is to inspire and to sort of ignite a spark that might lead to something else.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about craft, not as a hobby, but as a tool for change. Pottery ties our next guest to his indigenous Wangunk ancestors, but it also gives him a chance to teach others about the Wangunk people. Gary Red Oak O'Neill is a Wangunk elder and potter. His solo exhibition titled Excavations will be on view at Wesleyan University this fall. He brought some of his pottery into the studio for us to see and experience. Gary is an educator. He spreads awareness of the history of the Wangunk people who lived in central Connecticut long before European settlers. Many people incorrectly believe that the Wangunk people have disappeared. They are not recognized as a tribe by the federal or state governments. Gary has also taught art to elementary students like past disrupted guest and former U.S. Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona. Here is Miguel Cardona talking about Gary in an interview for the Brainwaves video anthology.
Gary O'Neill, here in this building, John Berry Elementary School, he was my second grade art teacher. And, seeing him love what he does made me want to be an art teacher too.
Gary Red Oak O'Neill, thank you so much for joining us on Disrupted.
Thank you for having me.
You have been a member of Wesleyan Potters since 1968. Mm-hmm. Share with our listeners what drew you into pottery and the form of it.
The reason I got into pottery was my brother, my oldest brother was getting a pottery merit badge, and I would tag along with him when he was getting his lessons from the local art teacher. And so that's how I was introduced to clay in the beginning.
What is it about clay, about pottery, that now, given that history, that connects to the work that you create and build?
Well, just being raised with a great-grandmother that was Nipmuc and her husband, great-grandfather that was Wangunk, we went on a lot of walks in the woods, identifying trees and berries and all this, and talked to us about Mother Earth. And as I grew older, I kept thinking the power of Mother Earth. And my great-grandmother used to talk to us about the power of Mother Earth and all the gifts that we had and how we were always to respect it. So as I got older and started with clay, it was my first time I felt like I could express myself through something from the earth.
So that ability to express yourself, that connection, respect, and reverence for the earth comes through in your pottery. But it also comes through in the way that you talk about your role as an elder, your connection to your people and your history. And what I think is so important is the work that you are doing to counter this narrative that your people are a lost tribe, when in many ways they've been overlooked. Share with us how that connection allows you to counter that narrative.
Well, being part of the lost tribe and being the family genealogist since the 70s, before my great-grandmother died in 68, I had gone through labeling her photographs. And one of the things I loved about labeling the photographs is that I heard a story. And one story after another, and Native people are known for their oral stories. So that was our history. And then my great-grandmother said, but you are the one that is the most interested. And so I would always go to the cemetery with not only her, but my grandmother. And I looked at going to the cemetery as a history lesson, because as we went around the cemetery, I heard the history of the tribe.
Is there anything that you learned in the history of the tribe, of doing that sort of historical approach, that was surprising to you or that stuck with you as this is why we need to continue telling our stories in the unique art forms and ways of storytelling that you do?
One of the things is these were enduring people. And that was a big lesson, to know that how tough it is, how we endure, and how we bounce back, and how to keep your eye on the prize. And one of my ways of keeping my eye on the prize is when I went to Wesleyan University in the early 80s, we had to do a research paper. We had to research on a building or a place. And so I went to my great aunt, Clara Palmer, and she said, Gary, you could do the history of our people. So she was the record keeper. So she had the family Bibles, she had all of this. And she started talking to me, and I was so excited. So when I went to my grandmother's around the corner, my grandmother, I could tell that she wasn't receptive to this. And she said, why do you want to bring it up? You know, that it's all so painful. It's all so painful. So my father picked me up, and he saw my grandmother was in distress and upset. And he said, Gary, why do you want to open a book if it's too painful? So I walked away and I said, well, I do have this paper due at Wesleyan, and I really think it's a good project. So later that night, I talked to my Aunt Clara, and she said, I've been over talking to your grandmother. She is upset, but we're going to go forward. Get over here at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we're going to start writing. You bring your tape recorder and your pad to write with. And so that's how I started, because I had labeled most of the photographs, so I was in good shape there. So I was just trying to put a story together about the lost tribe. And most Connecticut natives didn't know we even existed until the late 90s, when I started speaking on the Wangunks as the lost tribe, and I went to different local communities, and people started to learn more about it.
That role of being an elder, of being the family historian, the genealogist, of having to push through pain to tell this story, because as you know, it matters not just that the story is told, but it also matters who tells the story. Because of that authenticity, the reverence for the people who are part of that story. Do you feel that that is a heavy weight?
Oh, definitely. Yes. Definitely. I feel a heavy weight. And also, part of my job is to deal with the public, even though sometimes they ask really crazy questions about us that, frustrate me, because we were here for 10,000 years and the settlers were here for 400, and how they think history started with just the settlers. And for me to learn more about it and share with other tribal members is exhausting, because they don't understand the importance of history. And I do understand that. And that's why I'm in the elder. It's not just because I want to lead the group. I want to be part of correcting history.
You are definitely a part of correcting history. And you do that in so many forms. You do that in your storytelling. You do that through your pottery, your beautiful, amazing pottery. I feel honored that there are 3 pieces sitting right beside me as we have this conversation. And I'm looking at these pieces, the colors, the textures of that. And I'm reminded that you are also a teacher.
Right. For 48 and a half years.
Yeah.
And that was a joy. My brother used to say, I had 2 jobs. I worked at Wesleyan Potters teaching pottery at night, and then I taught during the day teaching art in Meriden. And my brother said to me one day when my car was being worked on and he dropped me off, he said, Gary, you go in smiling and you come out smiling. I was lucky enough to have 2 careers that I really totally enjoy. Now my new career is being, a Wangunk elder, which I've been for years, but now I'll be much more active with the tribe and perpetuating our rich history.
I think, Gary, often people think that as teachers, our role is to just teach students, and they don't often realize what we are learning from our students as well. Is there something that stands out to you?
I think about teaching Miguel Cardona in 2nd grade, and thinking about when he went home, it was the first time he had a minority male teacher, and all of a sudden he went home and said, "Mom, that's something I might want to do." And so we maintained a relationship for all these years. I went to visit him in D.C. In February of 23. But what I want to say is, when you look at students, it's not where they come from. This is a small chapter in their life. It is not their life. And you've got to take them from where they are and kind of nurture them. And Miguel and I have worked on this bread and broth where we've made thousands of dollars for the Gallery 53 in Meriden, and also the Meriden Soup Kitchen. I've done that for years. But to work with him was really very uplifting. But the most historic event in my teaching career was to go to D.C. and sit in his office.
To be able to see this person who you knew as a student very early in their career, to him then to go on to become the United States Secretary of Education, and knowing a bit about his journey of having people doubt him because of where his parents came from, because of language, and questioning whether he was capable. It also, to me, speaks to the importance of teachers who can see something in a child, in a student, a person that maybe they don't see in themselves at the moment, but you are creating a pathway.
Well, more students have said to me as they're producing some artwork, "Mr. O'Neill, you're so excited. You're so excited." I said, "Yes, I'm excited." He said, "Well, it's just okay. It's more than okay. Just keep going." And our job as a teacher is to inspire and to sort of ignite a spark that might lead to something else. That's our responsibility.
Was there a teacher for you who had that role? Was it, a family member or a teacher who ignited the spark for you?
My first pottery teacher, whose name was Clara Skinner Guy, she was our high school teacher, and she brought me to Wesleyan Potters because she said, "I've taught him as much as I can teach him. I want him to be able to go further with his love of clay." And so they took me on, and I have been at Wesleyan Potters for a long time. I'm considered Wesleyan Potters' baby because I have had all the jobs except in the office, loading kilns, sweeping floors, painting tables. I've done all of that. So that has always been my second home.
So our listeners know that I work at Wesleyan as a professor, as heading up this All-Written Center for Public Life. I do not have the Wesleyan cred that you have as having multiple degrees there, but also creating this art in community and being able to not just affirm history, but you have had this broad impact for such a long time. Before we started the formal interview, you were sharing with me why Wesleyan was so important to your family. Share that story with our listeners.
Well, when in 1961, my great-grandmother told my father that in 2 days, he had to get some babysitters. And we never had babysitters because either my grandmother or aunts, but we never had a paid babysitter. So my great-grandmother, Kate Eldora Bates, who was a Nipmuc Indian married to my great-grandfather, who was John Palmer, a Wangunk, said, "I need you to take me to Wesleyan University." And so my father said, "Why, great-grandmother?" And we called her Gar. "Well, why?" "Because I need to hear this man speak. And Wesleyan is one of the universities in this country that is allowing him to speak because he can't speak everywhere." And so my father got together with his sisters. They went in a couple of cars. My grandmother was kind of shaky on her feet. He drove on the lawn, dropped his great-grandmother off. His sisters held her by their arms and walked in, and they went to hear Martin Luther speak. And when they came home, we had 2 babysitters, and there must have been like 8 kids there, 10 kids, I forget, of the great-grandchildren. She sat us down, and she said, I can die now. And we said, "Why are you talking that way?" She said, "Because I met Jesus' brother." And we said, "Really?" She said, "This is the man that will make changes in your life and your children's life. He's not good for one group, but for everybody." And in the last chapter of my life, I feel hope because of a man like this that I saw. And she was able to see him 3 more times before she died. And she just loved Wesleyan, number one, because they allowed him to speak. A lot of places weren't allowing him to speak.
I shared with you that there is a photograph in my office right now, and that photograph is from when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Wesleyan to speak. And for me, it's such a powerful black and white photograph because he is in this space and he's surrounded by students, and you can see the skepticism on their faces. And you can also see and really feel his resolve to say, even though there may be some who don't want me here, I am going to be here. And in some ways, that reminds me of your tribe, of your people, of the need to remind people to show up in your full self, even when people aren't sure that you should be there or work against that acknowledgement. And that is also, for me, how pottery becomes so important because it can endure. That so much of the history is an oral history that if we don't capture it in some way, it dies with our elders. And you have been so committed to, we need to not only capture the footprint, but create that legacy through the work. You have an upcoming exhibition that will be at the Zilka Gallery at Wesleyan this fall. It's called Excavations. Tell us about this exhibition.
Well, it's got a variety of techniques that I've used, and I was motivated by going to the Hollister Farm in South Glastonbury. And this is a farm that has stayed in the same family for 10 generations. So grad students are there every summer digging up all kinds of artifacts, which I've been able to visit at UConn Archaeology Department. But also, they have taken good notes of the relationship with the early settlers. And they're right around in a farm that was, I think the foundation they excavated was 1641 or something. So all of these artifacts around them tell a story about the relationship that the Wangunks might have had with the settlers. So just learning about that has been really exciting.
What does it mean for you? How does it feel for you to be able to be in this space that you can touch things that your ancestors, that your elders were a part of? What is that feeling for you?
I mean, when you touch these artifacts that are thousands of years old, and you say to yourself, I just want this energy. That's one of the things. I said, please give me some of this energy. That's one of the things I think about, the energy that the artifacts represent. But also, where am I going to take it? And what's my responsibility? I don't have to reproduce the same pottery as they do, but I have to have a message with my work. And part of this show is a message that it's the first Wangunk exhibit by a university. Also, Wadsworth Atheneum has just bought a piece from me, and they have it in their permanent collection. So we are getting the Wangunk name out there, and people are responding and wanting to learn more.
I'm curious what you see as the broader power or responsibility of craft and art in society.
Well, first of all, going to an art school, Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, I was with some dynamite people. And as a result, I see the work that Joyce Scott is doing. She's a fiber artist. I see how important her work, how it translates. I've had all different exhibits. One of my favorite exhibits was Comforts from Our Past. And I used old broken up furniture from my great-grandmother's house. And my cousin said when we were cleaning it out, look why are you collecting all the old broken up furniture? I said, I'm going to create something. And when they came to the exhibit, and it was at Wesleyan Potters in 2016, oh, that's part of the chair we were rocked in. Oh, gee, that's the woodwork. Oh, that's the broken frame that was going to be fixed and wasn't. So I incorporated the caning of the chairs. So all of this came through in that exhibit. And I think that was such an exciting exhibit, just like this exhibit, but in a different way, because I had the chance before I started creating, to pull together all these different pieces of work that were reminiscent of my past, reminiscent of my people. And it's so important for people to see it.
Can you describe some of the pieces that are here with us today? I have to tell you, I can't take my eyes off of this blue piece because there are so many layers and textures to this. And I keep asking myself, how long does it take to create a piece like this?
Yeah.
Because it's so intentional and beautiful. It's simple and complex in the best ways. Describe for our listeners some of what they will see.
Well, one of the things you will see, I have always had a relationship with texture. I love the idea of texture, whether it's carving, whether I'm using a tool, whether I get texture with a glaze, or texture just by putting an iron oxide on and then carving through and seeing what the raw clay looks like. In one of the pieces that is my favorite, you will see I used a fine-tooth comb to put the waves in that represent the Connecticut River. And when my grandmother was watching me make pottery, she said to me one time, she said, "Gary, always make sure you have something that represents the most important thing to Wangunks." And one of the most important things was the river because that represented transportation and trade. So in my piece, I made sure that I've used some of the pieces, I've used that whole idea of water.
You can see that in the piece. There's movement to this piece. There is this connection and the flow of it that when you, and just so our listeners know, when Gary brought these pieces out of the box, I was instantly drawn to them and had to remind myself, okay, don't touch this piece, observe it, because it draws you in. And one of the things that I think will be so important for this exhibition and what I'm looking forward to is the ways that you will be able to draw people into the space, to the connection, to learn more about your people and your story. But your work also, I think, invites and challenges us to think about our own stories.
And we all have our own stories.
Yes.
We all have our own stories. They're all very different. But I think the idea that you could create an image or a sculpture or a piece of pottery that can take you in another direction. And part of artwork is a good piece of artwork. My art teachers used to say, it should make you want to go around the corner. What's around the corner? And it's not whether it's just that piece, but the piece that follows. As I'm ending all the preparation for this show, I'm thinking about the next show. But this has been one of the best projects in my life, being a representative of the Wangunks.
Well, we are so honored that you are sharing your work with us, that you are inviting us in to consider our stories and to appreciate the stories that are around us each and every day. And I think we need that very much right now. Gary Red Oak O'Neill is a Wangunk elder, potter, and educator. His solo exhibition is titled Excavations. It'll be on view this fall at the Ezra and Cecile Zilka Gallery at Wesleyan University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. This episode was also produced by our former interns, Coco Cooley and Kathy Wang. Additional thanks to Meg Dalton and our former interns Isaac Moss and Angelica Gajewski. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. Just search for Disrupted and Connecticut Public. And if you love an episode, please remember to leave us a comment. You can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.